What if a single bet could completely transform the life of a millionaire? He had everything money could buy, but an unexpected challenge forced him to confront his own values and discover the true meaning of connection and redemption. Get ready for a story full of emotional twists where pride, love, and redemption collide in surprising ways. Robert Harris was the kind of man who didn't just enjoy winning. It was his way of life. A millionaire businessman, he strutted through high society parties like a king in his own kingdom. That Manhattan evening was no different. The room sparkled with dazzling lights, expensive champagne, and people vying for a moment of his attention. His tailored suit seemed sculpted directly onto his skin. Famous women and flawless models cast admiring glances as he passed, some even offering rehearsed giggles while greeting him. For Robert, this was the perfect setting. Everything was under control. Ethan, his longtime friend, approached with a teasing grin, a glass of whiskey in hand. "How many of these have you already conquered, huh?" Robert shrugged, feigning modesty. "I've lost count, Ethan. When you have what I have, the choices are limitless." Ethan was one of the few who dared to provoke Robert. They shared a history, a friendship built on competition. Ethan knew exactly how to plant seeds of doubt in Robert's pride. "You're always in control, aren't you? Everything in your life is an easy game." He sipped his whiskey, leaving the challenge hanging in the air. But what if it was something different? Something you couldn't mold the way you do with everything else? Robert raised an eyebrow. He loved challenges, and Ethan knew it. The look on Ethan's face showed he had something planned. "Go on, Ethan. You know I never turned down a bet." Ethan smirked, savoring the moment. 6 months. Married to a woman who challenges all your standards. No models. No celebrities. A real person. He paused. "And if you win, I'll sell you the summer house." The summer house. Just those words awakened something in Robert. It was the one thing he still wanted but couldn't have. For years, Ethan had refused to sell it, but now he seemed willing, with a price. "All I have to do is marry someone outside my standard." 6 months? Too easy. Easy? Let's see. Ethan discreetly pointed to a woman in the corner of the room. Sarah Williams. Strong, confident. Nothing like the kind of woman you consider worthy of your attention. "What do you think of her?" Robert's eyes followed the direction. Sarah was chatting animatedly with a group, her laughter echoing with a sincerity that seemed out of place in that setting. She was different, completely different. Interesting. He narrowed his eyes. "If this gets me the house, then I'm in." And so, with a handshake and a smug smile, Robert accepted the bet that would change his life in ways he could never predict. Sarah Williams wasn't a woman who intimidated easily. From a humble background, she had built her life on hard work and determination. Her personality was strong, her confidence unshakable. Perhaps that was what made her laughter so unique in that room full of superficiality. She had no idea that just a few meters away, Robert Harris was watching her every move with a curious, calculating gaze. Ethan had already spoken to Sarah a few days earlier, explaining that a special man was interested in meeting her. What he hadn't mentioned was the true nature of the game. When Ethan approached her, Sarah immediately noticed the conspiratorial expression on her friend's face. Before she could ask, he was already introducing Robert. "Sarah, this is Robert Harris. I'm sure the two of you will have plenty to talk about." Robert extended his hand, his smile polished but hollow. Sarah shook it firmly, challenging him with her gaze. This wasn't a woman who played by anyone else's rules, and Robert realized that immediately. "Robert Harris, the famous businessman. I've heard of you." Her voice carried a tone of curiosity mixed with skepticism. Robert gave a rehearsed smile. He was used to being admired, but Sarah's gaze seemed to analyze him deeply, as if she could see beyond the facade. "I hope it's good things," he replied with mild irony. "That depends on you, doesn't it?" Sarah replied, raising an eyebrow. She turned to Ethan. "Why exactly did you want me to meet him?" Ethan laughed, trying to lighten the tension. I just thought the two of you might get along. Sarah, you're always so guarded. And Robert, well, he's persistent. Sarah didn't look convinced, but she didn't reject the idea either. There was something about Robert that intrigued her, though she couldn't quite define what it was. In the days that followed, Robert began to act. He knew he needed to earn Sarah's trust for the bet to work. His first move was to invite her to dinner at one of the city's most luxurious restaurants. Sarah hesitated before accepting. Part of her was curious to understand why a man like Robert was interested in her. She was confident, yes, but she knew she wasn't the type of woman he usually chose. At the restaurant, Sarah arrived promptly. Robert, already waiting at the table, stood up to greet her. She was impeccable but understated, something Robert noticed and secretly admired. "You look beautiful," he said, with a smile that tried to seem genuine. "Thank you," Sarah replied with a slight smile. "I have to admit, I'm curious. Why did you invite me to this date?" Robert was prepared for this question. He knew he couldn't be completely honest, so he chose his words carefully. "I want to get to know you better," he replied. "You seem like someone worth spending time with." Sarah leaned slightly forward, observing Robert with analytical eyes. Something about his response seemed rehearsed, but she decided not to press him for now. "Well, I guess we can start with that," she replied. "But I'll warn you, I'm not someone who's easily impressed." Robert gave a confident smile. He was used to women falling for his charms with ease. Sarah, however, was uncharted territory. Throughout dinner, the conversation flowed in an unexpected way. Sarah wasn't intimidated by the luxurious setting or by Robert's presence. She spoke openly about her life, her achievements, and the challenges she had faced along the way. Every word seemed to disarm Robert in some way. As Sarah spoke, Robert realized something he had never experienced before. He was interested, genuinely interested. It wasn't just part of the bet. There was something about Sarah that fascinated him. "You really don't seem like anyone I've ever met," Robert admitted, unexpectedly honest. "You have a strength that's uncommon." "Thank you, I guess," Sarah said, with a cryptic smile. "But I'm just myself. It's not something so extraordinary." The evening ended with a firm handshake and a shared look that seemed to promise more meetings. As Sarah returned home, she wondered what exactly Robert wanted. Meanwhile, as Robert returned to his penthouse, he began to realize he might be stepping into a game much bigger than he had anticipated. In the days that followed, Robert made sure to stay in touch. He sent messages, made calls, and frequently invited Sarah to different activities. With each meeting, he learned more about her and discovered that, despite his initial intentions, he was becoming increasingly intrigued. Sarah, on the other hand, remained cautious. Despite feeling drawn to Robert's intelligence and charm, she knew there was something about him that still didn't feel entirely honest. It was during a walk in a local park that Sarah finally confronted Robert about his intentions. They were sitting on a bench, surrounded by trees, as the sun began to set. "Robert, what do you really want with me?" she asked, turning to face him directly. "I feel like there's something you're not telling me." Robert hesitated for a moment. He knew the truth was far too complicated to reveal. Even so, Sarah's question seemed like the perfect opportunity to move his plan forward. He took a deep breath, locking eyes with hers, forcing a spark of passion into his expression. "I know we haven't been seeing each other for long, but you're everything I've ever looked for." Then he knelt before her, gently holding her hands. "Sarah, will you marry me?" Sarah was surprised by the gesture, but the truth was, she had already imagined spending her life with Robert. Smiling, she answered without hesitation, "Yes." The wedding ceremony was exactly as Robert planned. Luxurious, flawless, and completely devoid of emotion. It was a spectacle carefully crafted to maintain appearances, like everything in his life. Guests murmured about the unexpected couple, especially about Sarah, but she stood firm. She wasn't naive. She knew there was something about Robert that wasn't entirely transparent. Even so, she chose to focus on the moment. After all, she truly believed she might find something genuine beneath his carefully calculated perfection. After the ceremony, Robert escorted Sarah to the limousine, maintaining the same facade of charm and confidence he had displayed throughout the event. But inside the car, the silence between them was almost palpable. "Well," Sarah said, breaking the silence, "it seems we're officially husband and wife now." Robert smiled faintly but didn't respond immediately. He looked out the window as he thought about what was to come. The wedding was merely a formality. The next 6 months would be the real challenge. "Yes," he finally replied. "I hope you're ready for this." Sarah raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "Ready for what, exactly?" Robert hesitated for a moment before responding, choosing his words carefully. "For life with me. It might be different from what you're used to." When they arrived at Robert's new penthouse, Sarah was greeted by an impressive sight. The apartment was a masterpiece of modern architecture, with floor-to-ceiling windows revealing the city below. Robert watched her reaction closely. "It's impressive," Sarah said as she walked through the room. "But honestly, it's not what defines a home." Robert smiled, but there was something different in his expression. He was used to people praising his wealth, but Sarah's reaction intrigued him. "And what defines a home, in your opinion?" he asked, crossing his arms. "People, real connections, shared moments," she replied without hesitation. "Things that can't be bought." Sarah's words hit Robert in a way he didn't expect. He shrugged, trying to dismiss the discomfort he felt. In the days that followed, the dynamic between the two began to take shape. Robert, true to his plan, tried to impress Sarah with extravagant gifts, expensive jewelry, designer clothes, luxury trips. But to his frustration, she turned everything down. "I don't need this, Robert," she would say, with a calmness that irritated him. "If you want this to work, you'll have to try a different approach." For the first time, Robert felt his control being challenged. Sarah wasn't like the other women in his life, and it intrigued him as much as it frustrated him. The silent standoff between them continued. Robert, determined to win, began adjusting his strategies. He couldn't admit it, but Sarah's resistance was forcing him to reinvent himself. Perhaps, for the first time, he would need to prove his worth in a way that money couldn't buy. One evening, Sarah was sitting in the living room, reading a book, when Robert walked in with 2 cups of tea. He had never done something like this before, but he was willing to try. "I thought you might like this," he said, extending one of the cups. Sarah looked at him with a surprised expression, but accepted. "Thank you," she said, before returning her attention to the book. Robert sat at the other end of the couch, silent, watching her for a few moments before asking, "What are you reading?" "A novel," Sarah replied, lifting her eyes from the book. "It's about 2 completely opposite people who end up finding common ground." Robert smiled. "Interesting. And do they end up together in the end?" "Maybe," Sarah said, with a mysterious smile. "But only if both are willing to change." Robert fell silent after that, but her words stayed with him. He began to realize that Sarah wasn't just a challenge for his bet, but also someone who was starting to change his way of thinking. Days turned into weeks, and the dynamic between them began to shift subtly. Robert still tried to impress her, but now it was in a more genuine way. He asked questions about her childhood, her dreams, trying to truly get to know her. Sarah, on the other hand, began to see something different in Robert. He was still arrogant and controlling, but there were moments when his facade seemed to crack, revealing someone more vulnerable. It was on a rainy afternoon, when the two were stuck in the apartment, that Robert revealed something that surprised Sarah. "Did you know I grew up in a house where nothing was ever enough?" he said, looking out the window. "My father always demanded more, and my mother never seemed satisfied." Sarah looked at him, surprised by his openness. "That explains a lot about you," she said softly. Robert chuckled, but it wasn't a laugh of amusement. "Maybe it explains it, but it doesn't justify it. I became what they expected, someone who only cares about winning." Sarah leaned forward, looking at him seriously. What if you try to be someone different? Someone who doesn't need to prove anything to anyone. Robert didn't respond immediately, but the weight of Sarah's words seemed to sink into him. He knew she was right, but change wasn't something he knew how to do. The first weeks of living together tested both Robert and Sarah's patience and limits. He, used to being in control, began to realize that Sarah was a challenge he had never faced before. She wasn't submissive, didn't follow his rules, and above all, didn't seem impressed by his money. Sarah, on the other hand, found in Robert a man who, although charismatic and intelligent, had an emotional barrier that seemed impossible to break. She didn't know if he was like this because he chose to be or because he was afraid to show who he truly was. One of the first tensions arose when Robert insisted that Sarah take a credit card to make her life easier. But to Sarah, it felt more like a method of control than a kindness. "It's just practical," he argued. "You don't need to depend on me for every little thing you want to buy." "I've never depended on anyone, Robert," she replied, placing the card on the table. "And I'm not starting now." Robert wasn't used to hearing no. Sarah's gesture completely disarmed him. Despite the tensions, there were moments of peace between them. On certain nights, while Sarah prepared something simple in the kitchen, Robert found himself watching her, intrigued. There was a naturalness in her movements that left him unsettled. On one of those nights, he decided to try something different. Instead of planning how to manipulate Sarah to his advantage, he simply approached and offered to help. "Can I chop the vegetables?" he asked, with a shy smile. Sarah laughed, surprised. "Do you know how to use a knife without looking like you're fighting it?" Robert laughed along, feeling a rare moment of lightness. "I can learn." As the two prepared dinner together, the atmosphere shifted. For the first time, Sarah saw a more relaxed side of Robert, and he realized that her authenticity made him feel different, less alone. After dinner, they sat on the balcony, watching the city lights. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable, but rather filled with meaning. "Why did you really want to marry me?" Sarah asked, finally breaking the silence. "And don't tell me it was just because you were interested in me." Robert froze for a moment. He knew he couldn't reveal the truth about the bet, so he chose a response that was partially true. "You're different from everything I know," he said. "I thought maybe I needed something or someone to challenge me." Sarah watched him closely, as if trying to decide if he was being honest. In the end, she just nodded and turned her attention back to the city lights. Later, as they both prepared for bed, something felt different. Sarah began to wonder if there was more to Robert than she had initially thought, and Robert, for the first time, questioned if he was truly ready to change. That night, while Robert slept restlessly, Sarah also found herself lost in thought. It was intriguing, yet unsettling. The next morning, Sarah decided she wouldn't just sit back and observe. She wanted to understand what drove Robert, but without him noticing. Perhaps it was the best way to uncover who he really was. Meanwhile, Robert seemed to be on a mission of his own. He still saw Sarah as a challenge, but something was shifting. His determination to win her over was slowly being replaced by a desire to understand her. It was during a dinner with business colleagues that tensions reached a new level. The evening began predictably. Robert's guests asked superficial questions and cast judgmental glances at Sarah. But, as always, she maintained her firm and confident demeanor, responding with humor and wit. "So, Sarah, are you involved in the business world like Robert?" one of the guests asked, clearly disdainful. "No, not in the same sense," Sarah replied with a calm smile. "But I know how to spot a good investment when I see one." The response drew laughter from the table, but Robert noticed the hidden intent in Sarah's tone. He knew she was talking about him, and not in a positive way. Later that night, when the two returned home, the confrontation was inevitable. Sarah was tired of being used as a pawn in Robert's social game, and he was frustrated by his inability to control her. "Why do you insist on taking me to these events?" Sarah asked, her voice heavy with exasperation. "You know I don't fit into that world." "Because you're my wife," Robert replied, trying to sound rational. "And it's part of the life we lead now." Sarah stared at him for a long moment before responding. "It's not part of my life, Robert. It's part of yours. Maybe you should ask yourself why you need this facade so badly." Her words hit him harder than he cared to admit. Robert didn't respond, but his expression revealed that something had shifted. He began to wonder if Sarah was right. In the days that followed, their relationship grew quieter, but no less intense. Robert began watching Sarah more closely, trying to understand her strength and what made her so different from anyone else he knew. It was on a quiet morning, while Sarah was having coffee on the balcony, that Robert decided to take the first step. He sat beside her, holding 2 cups of coffee, one of them for her. "I'm not good at this," he said, handing her the cup, "but I want to try." Sarah looked at him, surprised. "Try what?" "To understand you," he replied, with a sincerity she hadn't expected. "And maybe understand myself, too." For a moment, Sarah was silent, but then she nodded, accepting the gesture. It was the beginning of something, though neither of them knew exactly what. The proposal to visit Sarah's hometown came up unexpectedly. She mentioned the place casually during the conversation, and to her surprise, Robert showed genuine interest. Perhaps it was just curiosity, but for some reason, he seemed determined to learn more about her past. 2 days later, they were on their way. Sarah looked out the car window as the cityscape disappeared, giving way to quiet roads and open fields. She felt nervous, though she wasn't sure exactly why. "I don't know if you'll adapt to the pace there," she said, breaking the silence. "I've adapted to worse things," Robert replied with a smile. Sarah laughed, but there was still a silent worry in her eyes. She knew her hometown was vastly different from the world Robert was used to. When they arrived, the simplicity of the place was almost shocking to Robert. The streets were small, the houses modest, and people greeted each other with genuine smiles. It was a stark contrast to the sophisticated settings he always frequented. Sarah parked the car in front of her mother's house. It was a simple but cozy residence, with a well-kept garden. Her mother was waiting on the porch, wearing a warm smile. "Welcome," she said, coming down the steps to hug Sarah. Robert watched the scene silently, feeling like a stranger in a world that wasn't his. But when Sarah's mother turned to him, she offered him the same welcoming smile. "And you must be Robert. Come in. We have much to talk about." Inside the house, Robert felt something he hadn't felt in a long time: warmth. The walls were decorated with family photos, and the smell of homemade food filled the air. He was far from the luxury he was used to, but somehow he felt more at ease than he expected. Sarah seemed more relaxed than ever. She walked through the house with familiarity, showing Robert the little details that had been part of her childhood. He watched her closely, fascinated by this side of her he had never seen before. "You seem different here," he said as she pointed to an old photo on the wall. "That's because here I'm just me," she replied with a smile. "No games, no expectations. Just me." Sarah's words lingered in Robert's mind. He began to wonder who he really was outside of games and expectations. The answer unsettled him. Later that day, Sarah took Robert for a walk through the town. They strolled along quiet streets, stopping to greet people Sarah had clearly known for years. Robert felt something he rarely experienced: anonymity. It was when they reached a small hill overlooking the town that Sarah stopped and turned to Robert. "So, what do you think?" she asked, gesturing to the landscape. Robert took a moment before answering. "It's simple, but there's something beautiful about it." Sarah smiled, satisfied. For the first time, she felt that Robert was being completely honest. That night, as they were back at her mother's house, Robert helped wash the dishes after dinner. It was a small gesture, but one that didn't go unnoticed by Sarah. He was, in some way, trying. After the visit to Sarah's hometown, something felt different between them. Robert began to lower his guard, and Sarah, in turn, was willing to believe there was more to him than the arrogant man she had met. But the calm was about to end. The event happened unexpectedly on a quiet afternoon. Sarah was on the penthouse terrace, tending to some plants she had insisted on bringing into the apartment. Inside the living room, Robert was hosting Ethan for an informal meeting. He thought Sarah was out of earshot. "So, you can start thinking about what to do with the summer house," Ethan said with a teasing smile. "Seems like it's going better than I expected." Robert gestured for Ethan to lower his voice. "Keep your voice down. Sarah doesn't know about this." Sarah, overhearing the conversation through the glass door, froze. Her hand stopped mid-motion as Ethan's words echoed in her mind. The summer house? It didn't make sense. "You're more worried than you should be," Ethan continued. "Just complete the 6 months. After that, the house is yours." It was as if Sarah's world had stopped. She couldn't move, breathe, or think clearly. 6 months? The house? The truth began to emerge, and the pain followed. When Ethan finally left, Sarah was standing, waiting for Robert in the living room. Her eyes were filled with anger and betrayal. He knew, the moment he saw her, that something was wrong. "Are you going to tell me what that was, or should I guess?" Sarah asked, her voice sharp. Robert stood still, his heart racing. He knew he had been found out, but he had no idea how to repair the damage. "Sarah, I can explain," he began, but she raised a hand to stop him. "Don't bother. I think I've got it," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. "This was all a game to you. A bet." Robert tried to step closer, but Sarah backed away. "Don't touch me," she said. "I want to hear the truth. All of it." For the first time in his life, Robert found himself without an answer. He tried to find the right words, but all he managed was a whisper. Yes, it was a bet. At first, the words echoed in the silence, hitting Sarah like a knife. She shook her head, unable to believe she had allowed herself to be deceived. "At first," she repeated, with a bitter laugh. "And now? Do you expect me to believe you've changed?" Robert tried to speak, but Sarah didn't give him a chance. "I trusted you, Robert. I thought you were trying to be different, but you were just playing." She grabbed her bag and walked toward the door. I don't know what you're going to do, but I know what I will. I'm leaving." Robert was left alone in the room, the weight of the moment crushing him. For the first time in his life, he felt he had lost something that truly mattered. Robert sat in silence, the sound of the empty apartment surrounding him. He didn't know what to do. Sarah was gone, and he knew it was entirely his fault. Her words echoed in his mind. "I thought you were trying to be different." That hurt more than he had expected. He wanted to be different. Or did he? Robert had never stopped to reflect on who he really was. In the days that followed, he avoided his meetings and social commitments. He couldn't hide behind his routine. Instead, he spent hours staring out the penthouse window, looking at the city lights and thinking about what he had lost. One night, unable to bear the silence, Robert grabbed a bottle of whiskey and started drinking. It didn't take long for memories from the past to surface. He thought of his father, a man who never showed affection. Everything was about achievements, money, and control. And his mother, always elegant but cold as ice, concerned only with the family's appearance. It was in that environment that Robert learned to be who he was. But now, alone in the silence, he began to realize that maybe he didn't need to be that man anymore. The next morning, he woke up with a headache and a determination he hadn't felt in years. He knew he couldn't fix everything at once, but he also knew he needed to start. The first thing he did was pick up the phone and call Sarah. The call went straight to voicemail, but he didn't give up. He sent messages, apologizing, but no response came. As days passed, he realized words wouldn't be enough. Sarah needed actions. He needed to prove he was willing to change, not just for her, but for himself. Robert started small. He reached out to a local charity, something he had never done before. He offered financial support, but was invited to visit the place and meet the people who would benefit. The visit was transformative. He met families facing struggles he could never imagine. For the first time, Robert felt genuine empathy, something he had never allowed himself to feel before. He began spending more time outside his bubble. Instead of fancy dinners, he visited neighborhoods he would have avoided before. Each encounter seemed to break down a little more of the armor he had built over the years. Yet, Sarah remained out of reach. Robert knew that changing wasn't enough. He needed to find a way to show her that his transformation was real. That's when he had an idea. Something grand, yet sincere. Something that would show not just Sarah, but himself that he was willing to be vulnerable. He began planning, taking care of every detail. It wasn't just about impressing her. It was about showing her that he finally understood what truly mattered. Meanwhile, Robert continued his internal journey. Each day was a reminder of how far he had come and how much further he still had to go. He felt like he was on the right path. The big day arrived. Robert was nervous in a way he had never felt before. He had faced rooms full of skeptical investors and delivered speeches to hundreds of people, but none of that compared to what he was about to do. He knew there was no turning back. His decision to expose everything publicly was risky, but he needed Sarah to know he was no longer the same man. He wanted the world to see his vulnerability. The event was planned in an open-air space, in one of the city's busiest squares. There were guests, journalists, and even curious bystanders, all waiting to hear what Robert Harris had to say. Robert stood on the stage, but this time, without his usual armor. He wore simple attire, without the flashy accessories that usually completed his image. He wanted to be just himself. He looked at the crowd and took a deep breath before starting. The first person he searched for in the crowd was Sarah. He knew she was there, but he couldn't see her yet. "I want to thank everyone for being here today," he began, his voice firm but laden with emotion. "But today, I'm not here as the businessman you know. I'm here as a man who has made mistakes." The crowd fell silent, intrigued. Robert continued, speaking about his obsession with control, his need to prove his worth, and how that had led him to make decisions he deeply regretted. "Several months ago, I did something I'm not proud of," he confessed, his voice faltering slightly. "I turned a relationship into a game. I made a bet that treated an incredible person like a prize. I didn't expect this, but I really fell in love." There were murmurs among the crowd, but Robert continued. He spoke about how meeting Sarah had changed him, how she had made him realize that his priorities were completely wrong. "Sarah showed me what it means to be authentic, to be vulnerable," he said, his voice growing stronger. "And that's why I'm here today, to apologize, not just to her, but to everyone I've ever treated as tools for my own goals." He looked again at the crowd, and this time he spotted Sarah. She was at the back, partially hidden, but he saw her gaze, confused yet attentive. "Sarah, if you're here, I want you to know I'm sorry," he said, directly to her, though the crowd didn't know exactly who he was addressing. "I'm sorry for treating you in a way you didn't deserve. I love you." Robert paused, taking a deep breath before continuing. He knew he was exposing himself in a way he never had before, but he also knew he needed to do it. "I know words aren't enough," he said, "and maybe I'll never be able to fix what I've done. But I want you to know that I'm changing, that I want to be a better person, not just for you, but for myself." The crowd applauded as Robert finished, but he barely noticed. His gaze was still fixed on Sarah, waiting for a reaction. She didn't clap, but she didn't leave either. She stayed there, looking at him, as if trying to decide if he was being sincere. When the event ended, Robert stepped off the stage and walked slowly toward her. He was nervous but determined. "Thank you for coming," he said, stopping a few steps away from her. "Do you think this is enough?" she asked, her voice calm but firm. Robert shook his head. "No, but it's a start." The days after Robert's public confession were a test of patience and hope. He knew he couldn't demand anything from Sarah. What he could do was continue showing, through actions, that he was changing. Sarah, on the other hand, was torn. She couldn't ignore the impact of Robert's words, but she wasn't ready to trust him. He had broken something precious, and she wasn't sure if it could be repaired. It was only a week after the event that Sarah decided to meet him again. She needed answers, but more than that, she needed to understand who Robert truly was now. They met at a discreet cafe, far from the spotlight that used to surround Robert. He arrived first, visibly nervous. When Sarah walked in, he stood up but didn't attempt to hug her. "Thank you for agreeing to meet me," she said, sitting down. "I should be thanking you," he replied, "for giving me this chance." The silence between them was brief but full of tension. Finally, Sarah broke the ice. "Why did you do it?" she asked. "The public confession. It didn't seem like something you would do." Robert took a deep breath before responding. "Because I needed to. Not just for you, but for me too. I realized I spent my entire life hiding behind a facade, and it never brought me anything real. And now, what do you want from me?" Sarah asked, her voice calm but firm. Robert looked her in the eyes, his expression serious. "I want a chance to earn your trust back, to prove that I love you truly. But I know that's not up to me. It's up to you." Sarah stayed silent for a moment, absorbing his words. She wanted to believe him, but she knew she needed to be cautious. "If I decide to give this chance, there will be limits," she said. "I won't accept less than what I deserve." "You never should," he replied, with a slight smile. "And I should never have expected you to." With that, the conversation shifted to lighter topics. For the first time in weeks, both felt at ease in each other's company. The following months were a journey of rebuilding. Robert committed himself to proving he had truly changed, not just through words but actions. He began prioritizing genuine connections. He spent more time with people he had previously ignored, rebuilding relationships he had neglected. And above all, he respected Sarah's boundaries. Sarah, in turn, watched. She saw Robert's transformation, but didn't rush to make decisions. She knew trust took time. Finally, on a sunny afternoon, as they walked together through a park, Sarah stopped and turned to him. "I think I'm ready to try," she said, with a shy smile. Robert didn't hide the smile that spread across his face. The two walked side by side, in silence, but this time the silence was comfortable. It was the beginning of something new, something built on a stronger foundation. And for the first time in a long time, Robert felt he was exactly where he was meant to be. What would you do if you had to choose between your pride and something that could change your life forever? Share your thoughts in the comments. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget, give us a like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next ones. We have many exciting stories coming your way.